Hi, I'm Bob Power, Senior Vice President of Corporate Relations at OTC Markets Group. We're pleased that you've joined us for this month's event in our educational webinar series. The event is Navigating Life Science Microcap Space During the Crisis of COVID-19. Thank all of you for joining us. And we, first of all, hope that you're all staying safe and well as we're in a work from home environment. We'll wait a few minutes before we begin the webinar. In the meantime, I'll just mention some brief housekeeping items. All attendees will be in listen-only mode. In the upper right-hand corner, you'll see a questions box where you'll be able to submit your questions during the presentation. The presentation will last about 30 minutes. We'll then have 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A, where the presenters will answer the questions that have been submitted by the listeners from throughout the presentation. Before I introduce the panel from Zacks Small Cap Research, where they will discuss the life sciences sector landscape for microcap companies, I'll just give a couple of brief observations from OTC Markets' perspective. COVID-19 has brought about unprecedented challenges and potential opportunities throughout the life science landscape. OTC Markets Group has recognized a challenging landscape for all of its companies in all sectors due to COVID-19. For example, OTC Markets has temporarily provided COVID-19 related extensions on quarterly filing requirements, as well as providing extended relief for OTCQB and OTCQX companies with certain deficiencies related to bid prices and market value requirements. I'd like to point out that during this time, our markets, our equities markets, have remained resilient. For example, dollar trading volume on our premier markets of OTCQX and OTCQB were up 15% and 14% respectively in the month of March, though values were obviously lower. Well, based on issuer feedback, looking for insights in the life science microcap sector in particular, we've put together an excellent panel from Zacks Small Cap Research to specifically address how COVID-19 has affected the life science sector, in particular for public companies traded on OTCQX and OTCQB markets. Our panel from Zacks Small Cap Research will give their observations on what today's landscape is in this sector and what we can learn by looking at historical trends and opportunities for life science microcap companies. By way of background, Zacks Small Cap Research is a member of OTC Markets Premium Provider Directory as a research provider. We thank our three panelists, Anita Dushan, John Vandermosen, and Rich Hankey, for joining us today to provide insights and go through the challenges and opportunities for microcap life science companies that are traded on OTCQX and OTCQB markets. What we'll see is that first, Rich and Anita will make some comments on how COVID-19 has affected the space. Then John will compare this crisis to past crises. Then Anita will discuss action steps in scientific advancement. Finally, all panelists will discuss action steps in the capital markets. And with our panelists being from the same company, I'm sure we're going to get some interaction with different observations from all of them with their excellent backgrounds. I think I'll kick it off by going into the first slide that they have with the overall questions that we'd like to start out with is, how has 2020 started out and how is COVID-19 reshaping it, and what are the macroeconomic impacts from this pandemic? And with that, I'd like to hand it off to Rich to start the presentation from Zacks' side. So Rich, welcome, and thank to all of you for joining as our panelists today.
All right. Thank you, Bob. Hello, everyone. How are you? Yeah, so I'm gonna talk about a few things on this slide. Anita's gonna weigh in as well, and you know, who knows, John may have some comments as well. But let me just start out with, you know, the again, we're trying to focus here on, when we say the space, we're really talking about the microcap life sciences space, which I think is what's most important to everybody in our audience today. The first bullet point I have on there is China. I mean, China, what can I say? Everyone's read the news. What could I possibly add? I mean, the reality is, you know, most people think it started in China, and this is a health crisis that became an economic crisis that really has become a political crisis. And, you know, and things like the funding for the World Health Organization, things like that. So, but I think the one point I do want to add, and I don't know if everyone noticed it, as part of this political situation with China, the Senate has approved legislation that all foreign companies need to certify that they're not under the control of a foreign government. And clearly they were pointing their finger at China, okay, because that is a situation with Chinese companies. And if they can't necessarily, if they're not satisfied, they're pulling the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, you know, the PCAOB, to basically audit the last 3 years and to prove that these companies are not under the control of their government. And again, it's not just China, it's every foreign country. So not sure where that's going to go, but I think one thing, and I think our friends at the OTC may have a point of view on this, is that, you know, under current OTC reporting, foreign companies can choose to report under their respective, you know, accounting rules, and, you know, they don't necessarily have to follow SEC rules when reporting here in the U.S. And I'm just wondering, and this is something to keep a lookout for, is that going to change going forward, where the SEC is going to require, you know, any foreign company that's going to report and to try to track U.S. investors, that, and if they want to do that, they have to report and follow U.S. SEC regulations, which is not currently the process. So I think we need to keep our eye on that. The second bullet point is, you know, energy prices. I mean, this is not directly related to COVID-19, but it's all falls in there. You know, with it, obviously with the way that oil prices went over the last month or so, or you know, leading up to the last month or so, tremendous drop in oil prices, and supply's been reduced recently by Russia, so I think prices are ticking upward a bit. What does this matter? I mean, the reality is it matters because, as you may know, in small businesses are disproportionately affected by changes in energy prices, both up and down. And I think a lot of you are, you know, in the business of chemistry, and chemical prices are dramatically impacted by energy prices. So I think there's a couple studies out there. I want to throw these numbers out here. The study was, for every $1 increase in the price of a barrel of oil, that costs the chemical industry $660 million. And for every $1 per million BTU increase in the cost of natural gas, it adds 3.4 billion cost to the industry. So energy prices matter dramatically, you know, in the small cap space. So now, speaking of small cap space, micro and small cap stocks, the third bullet point there, I've got a couple stats here, which is, I think, you know, it's always good to take a step back. And I'm going to throw out some changes in valuation. These are year-to-date figures, not since the crisis began, but I think it gives you the picture, and it kind of displays the divergence that we're seeing. Let's see, the Russell MicroCap Index, this is as of Friday, the Russell MicroCap Index is down 18% year to date, okay? The LD Micro Index is down 14% year to date. The Dow Jones, everyone's favorite index, is down 15% year to date. But if you go to the bio sector, all right, the New York Stock Exchange Bio Index, the BTK, is up 11% year to date. The NASDAQ Biotech Index is up also similarly 11% year to date. And I think it's at an all-time high, if I'm not mistaken. And then the S&P Biotech ETF is up 11 and change, maybe 11.5% year to date. So you can see quite a divergence in performance of, you know, of the overall market in the overall market, by the Dow, in the performance of the microcaps in general, in terms of the Russell and the LD Micro, but also focus on bio, much, much better performance year to date, in the bio sector. So with that said, I want to turn it over to Anita. She wants to make a couple points on drug discovery and government intervention. Anita?
Hello, good morning, everyone. And thank you for having me, Bob, and happy to be part of the panel today.
Thank you,
Rich,
Anita.
yeah.
Thanks for joining.
Yeah. So Rich, so from what we've witnessed from past recessions and based on our own research, our take on the life sciences industry as a whole, we feel that it is actually less susceptible to market dynamics, usually in the crisis, because economic downturns don't affect the need for healthcare as much as other cyclical industries. While the race is on to get a vaccine or an antiviral for COVID-19 that could potentially help bend the pandemic's hockey stick curve, the scientific and logistical challenges are truly daunting. While we are, thinking of repurposing existing drugs, which is definitely a faster way to tackle this epidemic, it does not come without risks. So based on the industry's past responses to pandemics, we cannot rush medications prematurely off to the front lines. For example, in the past, be it SARS or MERS, ribavirin, a broad-spectrum antiviral, was initially used, but even though it provided only a very thin evidence of efficacy, and in some cases actually worsened patient outcomes. So repurposing drugs, although provides a quick and easy path to market, may only provide little benefit. The current pandemic, though, is much broader. Earlier also during this time, we saw hydroxychloroquine that garnered interest. It has shown not so great clinical trial data, and there have been evidence of toxicities in heart and liver. So I would say drug development, already that is very unpredictable and expensive undertaking, is taking on an even greater uncertainty during this pandemic. And innovation and advances in therapeutics, and which are critically dependent on clinical research, are also threatened, and our ability to meet this urgent medical need is at stake. These needs range from, the ability to fight this newly virulent infection like COVID-19, but it also affects other drug development, which address 7,000 rare diseases that are impacting more than 300 million people around the world. And these challenges are arising from site closures, travel limitations, and interruptions to the supply chain for the investigational drug. Now, we know that big pharmas have put brakes on commencing new trials because hospital sites are requiring the clinical staff to attend the overwhelming number of COVID-19 patients. And there are also interruptions to data collection from ongoing clinical trials and difficulties setting up clinical trials up and running because patients are now reluctant to enroll or unable to visit hospitals. There are two areas that definitely warrant attention related to drug development, and the first one being the increasing costs with R&D, and also the evolving relationship with the regulatory authorities. The R&D department, both in the industry and academia, is taking strides towards making drug discovery faster, cheaper, and more viable at all levels. And today's pharma industry faces a wide variety of challenges, with the most pressing being the ongoing crisis. And we see that, to help with this situation, government is definitely intervening. And globally, government intervention has been taking unprecedented moves. So they have provided both fiscal and monetary stimulus to support struggling economies. For example, in Europe, the government is fast-tracking and promoting research on COVID-19. They have mobilized funds in the amount of close to £450 million to develop vaccines, diagnostics, new treatments, and they're also giving it to startups for innovative solutions. Additionally, the European Union has put forward a package of more than £500 billion that provides a safety net for workers, businesses, and the European Union countries. In the US, though, unlike the past crisis in 2008, where the government intervened to bail out banks, the current situation warranted a deeper intervention. And the Federal Reserve Bank actually funded 1.2 trillion to bail out almost everybody. The Fed also did a quantitative easing, including purchases of corporate and municipal bonds. Despite this, and also cutting the rates to almost zero and relaxing the reserve requirements for banks to keep the cash flowing, we are still struggling with the economic damage. What one needs to really understand is we are trying to balance two conflicting objectives, that is improving the economic outcome and controlling the virus transmission. The CARES Act, Coronavirus Aid, Relief and Economic Securities Act, a stimulus bill was released for over 300 billion federal funding to help the economy, to support American institutions, including national businesses. Now, specifically for the life science and biotech companies, the provisions that this CARES Act provided are 80 million to the FDA to continue efforts related to COVID-19, about 30 million to the fishermen, fisheries, and aquaculture farmers, 75 million to NSF to support molecular, cellular, physiological studies to cover COVID-19, to better understand the coronavirus genetics, transmission, etiology, and epidemiology, and almost $1 billion to NIH to support scientific research to better understand the prevalence, transmission, novel diagnostic approaches, and to treat and prevent the coronavirus. Even in the face of the global viral outbreak, the FDA has been unwilling to lower its standards. The agency has kept protecting public health as its chief responsibility. And we will revisit this topic a few slides down. But how
Anita,
are...
Bob,
Sorry.
hi, I just have a quick question. So it's good to see the government doing unprecedented assistance to all companies. And from what you're saying, the microcap life science companies are getting special attention directly. We've seen a lot of press with very high market cap companies doing some work on COVID research with some expectations. Is it your opinion that the microcap companies are getting enough attention and getting enough capital? You know, when they stack up against the huge corporate giants, what's your opinion of that?
Well, there was companies, you know, some companies fortunately raised capital before the COVID situation, and you know, those they are kind of maybe sufficient for the next 12 to 18 months, perhaps. But those that are likely to suffer are those companies that require capital for the next 6 to 12 months, but and those who did not have the fundraising plans already underway. And those small companies don't have a you know, robust shareholding structure, and for them financing is high, risk is high, especially if they require funds in the short term. So I think such companies will be forced to divest some of their assets, especially if the competitive and commercial landscape is already overcrowded. Right. Or they're going to put the preclinical ones on the back burner because they are very capital intensive. And in this scenario,
This is John. I was going to add to that just a little bit, if you don't mind. There are some non-dilutive financing opportunities out there for companies that are pursuing coronavirus, particularly that would be BARDA and CEPI grants that are available. And Bob, as you mentioned, you know, sometimes the bigger companies have a little bit better resources to get those grants, but they are available for smaller and microcap companies as well. So I just want to add that on to what Anita was saying.
I was also just going to quickly say that in such a scenario, you know, deal making could become popular as biotech behemoths continue to have substantial cash resources. And if they are not looking for any short-term surprises, they would definitely go for that.
Right.
Hey, and Bob, this is Rich. And anyway, just to finish up this slide, because we're talking about access to capital, just, you know, there is still plenty of VC activity going out there now. All right. Acknowledging what everyone said, there is still a lot of activity, and by my count, there are been Well, my last count was 14 life science IPOs year to date. I bet you the number's about 16 now since I looked it up. So there is some very strong capital markets activity going on now, even where everything's going on. So IPOs are happening, VC activity is happening, and
Right.
as our tagline says here at the bottom, then we can go to the next slide. We're seeing a marginal impact at best on the demand for drugs and healthcare, and the reality is pandemics do reveal, what do they call it, the soft underbelly of private healthcare. There's no question about that. But, for a lot of our development clinical stage companies that we have under coverage, we're, as kind of Anita and John, Anita alluded to, we're expecting their later stage development, years away from the COVID pandemic. So they're, if they've got the funding, they're in great shape. So I think with that, why don't we move on to the next slide and let John talk a little bit about, some specific crisis, lessons from past crises.
Thanks, Rich. And yeah, this is John, and great to be here today to join on this call. As Rich mentioned before, he was comparing many of the biotech indices to the broader market, and in each instance, we saw that biotech had done better and had actually even been up for the year despite all of the disruption that we've faced. And I wanted to take what was happening in this circumstance right now and then compare it to past crises that historically had happened. So I did a little look back and just compared the BTK to the broader index. I wasn't going to look at all different parts of it, but in the 2008 recession, we saw the BTK outperform. And I also went back to the early 90s, and then also in 2000, 2001, when we saw the recessions in those periods. And in each case, the biotech index outperformed the broader index. And as Rich and Anita mentioned, there are a few reasons for this. The biotech space, the pharma space is very innovative. They're coming up with new technologies. The products that they produce are not so economically sensitive. And a lot of times what they're producing is going to be in the future sometime. So it's not really sensitive to what is going on right now. I took a little bit further look into some of the other parts of what went on during the 2008, 2009 crisis and volatility. And I was actually surprised at what I found because biotech held up pretty well in all the different aspects of what you think of when there's a recession. We think of employment, we think of R&D spending, we think of IPO activity and M&A activity. And while 2008 did see a decline in all of these areas, it was less severe than it was in other spaces, especially banking for the 2008, 2009. There were many bankruptcies there, but biotech actually only had a few, and it was really with companies that were not so far along in their research.
John, hi. Thank you, John. That's really interesting. I guess it's good to see and encouraging to see the positive performance in general versus the overall sector. I'm just wondering, is that across from an investor type? Is it the retail community, the family funds, the institutions, the venture capital community? What do you see as the reason for the recognition, and hopefully we'll see trends similar in this environment right now, but do you think it's across the landscape of investor type, particularly in from the perspective of our microcap companies?
Yeah, well, to answer that, I think all investors are looking for some kind of exit strategy, whether it's a product that will generate revenues and profits, or potentially M&A. And in the small cap biotech space, where there's a lot of R&D going on, M&A is generally the kind of the exit strategy that you'd look for. So what happens in a recession, and even in the last one, there were a lot of issues at big pharma, and they needed new ideas. And they get those new ideas from microcap biotech stocks. That's where the innovation is done. And what you saw, there were a number of products that were going off patent in the few years after 2009, and they needed to kind of fill up the tanks again with new ideas. So you saw a surge of M&A after the crisis. And we've kind of seen that today. In fact, I'll give you an example. Just this morning, we saw two actually important pieces of news that I think is great for small cap biotechs. there was an acquisition of actually a private company called Themis by Merck, and they're working on the COVID-19 space, and they're actually using a plasmid to achieve the vaccine. And then also we saw the Sanofi Regeneron divestiture announced, which actually could open up Sanofi to make a lot more acquisitions in the small cap space. So, these are just some of the things that are happening right now that suggest that we could see an exit strategy for smaller names.
Yeah, and I think that those types of transactions will pique the interest of all types of investors and get more interest in the sector, right?
I think so. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, interesting.
John, I quickly wanted to see if you could add a little bit more light on the IPO market, especially now in 2020. The challenge being that, obviously the COVID crisis hit us hard in March and April. So obviously we will be seeing a sort of weak performance in the Q2, which could hold back investors into the summer. So do you think that are the IPOs appropriately priced with the market volatility at this time?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. The IPO, and going back to the research that I had done earlier, IPOs kind of slowed down during 2008, but then they took off in the successive years and actually just exploded about 3 years later. So there was a lot of innovation going on that was seeking market funds. And as Rich just said, this year has been pretty strong on the IPO side. There have been 16 so far. I just checked it this morning, kind of updated everything, and there's actually 3 of the 16 which have had, and this is life sciences IPOs, not the broader market, just life sciences. There's been 16 of them, and there have been 3 that are up over 100%, and 1 is actually up over 300%. And I'm only seeing 1 or 2 that are down so far. So, it's just surprising to see, with all the market volatility going on and all the uncertainty, that IPOs are still getting done at a respectable pace. And not only they're getting done, but they're providing the IPO investors with some upside after they're offered.
Thank you, John. John, I just want to point out we have about 5 minutes before we switch to Q&A. So this, just wanted to point that out, guys. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll pass it on to the next speaker, or if there's any other question for me, happy to do that too.
Great. We'll go to the next slide. Next speaker.
Well,
or I'm happy to just chat for a bit on some of the other. Let me just say one observation that I made that I thought was quite interesting. And this goes back to the research piece that I did that looked at the 2008 crisis. When we think of recession and crisis like that, we think of unemployment, we think of cuts in R&D, we think of layoffs and all this. And one stat that I saw that I thought was quite interesting in the biotech industry is that there was only a 1.4% decline in employment, and this was a study done by Bio in biotechs. So there's 1.4% decline there versus a 6.9% reduction in employment overall. So it just goes to show that biotech and pharma continues on what it's doing, even when there's a lot of volatility going on and the market's falling and discretionary spending is contracting. They're still hanging in there.
That's
I'd also
excellent.
like to add that every crisis, has provided great opportunity to rethink things and redo them differently. And executives could, also have this opportunity to turn this crisis into advantage. So despite the hurdles, in the short term, some companies have stepped up and maintained a seamless connectivity in this time of remote working. They've adopted cost containment measures and they revalidated their timelines. Our research has shown some key takeaways from company leadership team that is addressing this crisis at this time. I think this situation actually serves as a strong reminder to allocate funds more efficiently. The ultimate goal is for drug development is to do it faster and manufacture it more cheaply and market it widely. So they are also looking into cost-effective and productive operation models. And also collaborations between companies are creating enterprises that have deep expertise in R&D and also stronger pipelines. We feel we are very optimistic about this progress, because the approach is different. and we are seeing successful outcomes from similar coordination in other businesses. In the midterm, we feel management will have a better visibility as their enterprise stabilizes, because in the post-pandemic period, we will see the implications of all the strategy that is being adopted currently, right? And the other thing is small cap companies invest in a lot of R&D, and some early stage lab-based companies have been able to maintain their critical experiments with a skeletal staff and to shift work to other locations around the globe. Some CROs have also remained operational, and that has also helped, but all this hasn't fully shielded the firms from the effects of the lockdown. There has been disruption of clinical trials, and also in general, though the biotech sector is protected because it has quite a bit of capital currently. In our coverage universe, we have seen that companies with the best prospects are those that have like more than a couple of candidates in their pipeline under development, and also own a technology platform that is capable of bringing multiple candidates to the clinic. They have less chance of being brutally hurt in this market. A business model that allows a company to add on to what they already have rather than have to pivot. That's a classic example of a business that we can bet on. Several of the affected biotech companies, though, are taking actions to reprioritize their R&D programs. And depending on the cash reserves they have, they are seeking co-development opportunities with the bigger players. And we also see a change in the way the regulatory agencies are working now. We think post-crisis, this will have the regulatory equilibrium change. The FDA has been responding and adapting to this dynamic situation. They've provided unprecedented flexibility to the labs and manufacturers to develop and offer COVID-19 tests across the US. And they've been extremely proactive and supportive of test development for both large and small labs. And at the end of March, FDA launched the CTAP program, under which they are now about 72 clinical trials and more than 200 therapeutic agents in development. And FDA has also been facilitating a collaborative effort with the industry, academia, and other government partners to simplify the regulatory process. So because of this, I think the studies are being adjusted to, perhaps even send the drugs to patients by mail or rely on telemedicine to have communication with physicians, while other studies have been able to continue with minor changes. Although we might have expected the FDA to be impacted by the COVID, I think the regulatory agency has actually been adapting to the changes very well. And they are also able to continue to expedite product development, even in the oncology space. So we think that, government and the people working together on this has brought up a huge change in the way we see things.
Thank you, and Anita. So this is Bob, and I just wanted to thank you and John and Rich for a very excellent overview. We do have time. We have about 10 or 15 minutes for Q&A, and so I'm monitoring questions coming in. So maybe I'll just read the question, and you guys can respond to a question that I see right here. And the question is, in the times of this COVID pandemic, are companies still looking for sponsored research? And I would add to that, particularly a microcap company, how do they persevere and get their story out there and get the recognition that they need and deserve in this unprecedented environment? So I'll put that question out there.
This is Rich. Let me start on that one, if you don't mind, guys.
Sure.
Every public company should have at least one independent research analyst covering it. All right. And there's different ways to find research. There's research you can get from the sell side. If you can get enough interest from the sell side, and that's difficult to do, as you all know, in the micro and small cap world. There are other types of independent research, which is kind of investor sponsored, if you will. You don't see that so much over here. You see it more in Europe, and that's another option. And that's what we do is company sponsored research. And obviously, I'm going to be a little self-serving in that sense that we've right now we've got 80 or 90 companies under coverage, so they they're pretty happy with what we do. So, but the bottom line is every company needs to have at least one research analyst following it, writing on it, and posting that research to the institutional and retail platforms. And that's most important, because you were talking quite a bit before there. You had a question before, Bob, about what retail investors, high net worth, family offices versus institutions. And the reality is you want serious investors, and serious investors are not going to invest in a company unless they get some kind of recommendation from an independent source, even a broker, right? So the research is, brokers, the right brokers are going to want to look at research to do it. You can certainly get, investors without research, but they're not, they're very short-term oriented research. They're just going to time the market. They're going to time the peak versus, the epidemic peak versus the market bottom. So a long way of saying, you do need to have some sort of independent research, Bob.
Okay, good. And I have to add, to get the visibility, we at OTC Markets, we offer an excellent cost-effective program called Virtual Investor Conferences. The life sciences sector is a really important part of that. We have a couple of life science focused conferences coming up over the summer. And the good thing is companies, CEOs can present right from their homes. We reach out to the audience, we publicize it. We recently held an event in a different sector a couple of weeks ago, and we had over 1,000 attendees with over 30 companies. So we think that sponsored research is really important, and then getting your story out in a cost-effective way is important too, and we help there as well. So it's a good double approach there, to get your story out in these times. And it's not easy for microcap companies. It's not as easy to get noticed as a larger market cap company. We recognize that.
Well, I mean, and in the biospace, in the biospace, I mean, it's a constant fundraising, right? You're constantly fundraising, and once you get the money, you got to start, looking ahead to when do you need it again, right? So you got to constantly be visible. You can't wait till the day before you need the money. I think everyone on this call knows that, but it's a constant visibility thing. And particularly with institution. What we're seeing, interestingly, is also another reason to get your research on these institutional platforms is because that's where big pharma goes. Big pharma is always looking at our research that we post to all, to the Refinitives and the FactSets and the Bloombergs of the world. Our research is on there, and big pharma, we can tell, is always there. A lot of it is window shopping, no question. They're just window shopping. What's going on? Right. But that's where they get a lot of their ideas, and from independent research, and that's how they, so we see it all the time. Let's put it that way.
Thank you. Okay, we have another question in here, and if you guys know the answer to this, we'll all do very well. And the question is, are we at the bottom? Is the market at the bottom right now? I mean, where do you see the life science sector performance-wise for the rest of the year?
Well, I mean, this is Richard again. The life, as we talked about at the beginning of the as John alluded to, and we talked earlier in the deck. I mean, the life sciences sector has held up pretty good, right? In there, and have we seen if we haven't seen the bottom, it's not like we're going to see a tremendous drop off, right? I mean, it's just not going to. It's not going to happen. And frankly, and I kind of alluded to it before, the investors that we deal with are the much more serious investors. They're much more longer term focused. They're in it not for what they're going to make tomorrow. They're in it for when is this when is this company going to move in the next step of the clinical trial process, and when is big pharma going to come in and swoop them up, or when are they going to go commercial, right? That's what their focus points are. So I think that there's quite a number of microcap focused investors out there that are not necessarily worried about timing, the market, so to speak. So
yeah, I'd make the point. This is John, that investing in a small cap biotech isn't really as attached to the market cycle as it is to what the company is specifically doing, and that's one of the reasons why an investor wants to have biotech as part of a diversified portfolio. I mean, it just plays a role because it's not really correlated to the markets. Because if a company has good data from one of their phase 3 trials and it's going to set them up to get approved and be commercialized, that is not going to be affected very much by what unemployment did over the last month. So I think biotech is going to be uncorrelated to the markets, and as the historical review that I did, it seems to outperform the broader market on the whole over an economic cycle as well.
So John, you mean historically in past economic crises, you've seen that performance in that regard, right?
I sure have. And I'd encourage everyone to take a look at the piece that we put together. It's called "What Impact Did the Stock Market Crash Have on Biotech Stocks in 2008?" And it takes a look back at a few past crises as well. But it's really informative on what happens. I mean, when I started working on it, I didn't quite know what to expect, but I found out some surprising things that biotech does hang in there during recessions. So it's worth taking a look at, I think.
Got it. Thank you. Okay, we have one more question, and then we'll wrap it up. And that question is, will the current regulatory environment make necessary changes to approve drugs quickly?
That's a tough one, but I can try to answer that.
Okay.
The FDA, it's very hard for them to change what is going on in the agency. There's some top-down pressure to be more efficient, and I think there's some bottom-up pressure, from patients and companies as well to get things done quicker, because a lot of time is wasted at the FDA, but it takes a while for that to happen. I think one of the efforts that's going forward right now is more use of biomarkers to determine whether things are successful, and that can actually help you through the earlier stage of the trial process when you're in phase 1 and phase 2. It can help you identify if drugs working right away, and it can happen faster. But as far as regulatory side, it's going to be difficult to do that. But I mean, I think on the edges things can improve over time. And Anita, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, I was going to say that definitely they have expanded their bandwidth for risk, considering the COVID-19 vaccine candidate from Moderna is being tested for safety in humans, and it hasn't been tested in animals yet. So they have definitely taken that one step forward. So I think going forward, they will definitely rethink about the timing, because timing is of essence right now, on how they can speed up their process internally.
Okay, well, thank you. That we again, Anita, Rich, and John, we really thank you all for a very informative and insightful presentation of the landscape in this really important sector. And we thank Zacks Small Cap Research. So with that, I most importantly also want to thank those that are listening in and the attendees. And we again wish everyone well and appreciate your joining us for this educational webinar. So with that, I will sign off now. Thank you.